Alright, so it's gonna start getting a bit more exciting from here. We're gonna do this smoke shockwave. Basically, we're gonna use particles, using particle flow to drive where we want the smoke to go. So I'm just gonna go under particle systems and create a PF source. And we can make it a circle, go into the particle view. And basically we only want to emit the particles for maybe 3 frames. And let's emit around 1,000 of them. So right now this is what we have. Then you want to go under the speed and say icon center out, and this will already give you sort of a shockwave style effect. So that's a good start. We can delete rotation and delete shape, and we need to add a delete operator so that the particles will disappear after a few frames. So we can say delete by particle H and set the lifespan to maybe 6 frames with a 1 frame variation. That should give us and increase the speed a little bit. And you can give it a little bit of divergence because right now they're all exactly on the ground and we want some of it to be higher up, so you can play with the divergence for that, so just a little bit should work. Now, as always, we need to create the grid, so I'm gonna use the shortcut here and just drag a fire and smoke sim grid around this shockwave setup like this, and let's go under the settings right away. And under grid, I want to set Z jammed minus so that the bottom of the simulator will act as the ground. We can decrease the resolution quite a bit, so maybe something like 0.4 meters should work. Maybe we can increase the conservation quality to 16. Let's set the steps per frame to 2, just because the particles move pretty fast and we don't really want any kind of stepping. As always, under output, let's output velocity. And all right, now we just need a source. So again, I'm going to use the shortcut here and create a fire source and add the particle flow particles as my source. So for the outgoing velocity, I'm going to do 2 meters. We don't really want any temperature. And one of the most important settings of this whole effect is this motion velocity. So let me turn it off and see what that will look like when I run the sim. So I'm running the sim and this is what we have right now. Basically, it's a disaster, but bear with me. So we're gonna go under preview and as always, enable the GPU preview. And you can see that basically without motion velocity, it's just creating trails, because the smoke is not getting speed based on the particles. So if you want the smoke to be given speed based on the particles it's coming out of, you need to actually keep the motion velocity enabled, and you can even emphasize that effect by raising this number. Alright, so with the motion velocity enabled, we are getting something a bit nicer, but it's still not working, and I found that it's because the emitter is way too close to the border of the grid, and the resolution is low, so it's not really catching all the particles. So you just need to raise this particle flow emitter a bit high up so it's sort of more inside of the grid. And now let's run it again. Alright, so you can see at this point it's working the way it should. We're emitting way more smoke, and the smoke now has the speed based on the particles, so it's gonna sort of accumulate on the edges and create the nice shockwave effect. So what I'm gonna do to make this nicer is hit 6 to go back into the particle view, and we're gonna delete the cache for now so we can see what's going on with the particles. And basically I think I'm just gonna reduce the variation to 0, and I'm gonna set the burst to maybe just 2 frames just to get a thinner ring basically. And I'm gonna increase the amount of particles to maybe 1500. And for the speed, maybe let's make that 100 meters. And maybe I'm gonna delete them after 5 frames. And let's go back under grid. And I feel like the resolution is really low right now. So maybe let's make it something like 0.3 meters for the cell size. So 3 million total cells. And let's run the sim and see if it looks better. Alright, so with those changes, we have a much nicer, cooler, sort of a faster and dramatic shockwave happening. Now, to make this even nicer, I think I'm going to increase the motion velocity effect because I don't like this thing in the beginning. I kind of just wanted to push the smoke instead of creating this UFO shape. So I'm gonna set the motion velocity to, let's say 5, and then go back under dynamic settings and maybe set the steps per frame to 3, because I feel like it's still not really catching the speed of the particles. I can see that steppiness in here. All right, so just a few frames in and I'm loving what I'm getting. It's kind of a brutal shockwave of maybe like a meteor hit or something like that. Now I'm gonna go back under grid and let's enable the adaptive grid by smoke and set the threshold to maybe 0.01 and extra margin to 5, so that the grid will now expand to accommodate the expanding shockwave and nothing will get clipped on the edges. I'm gonna run this for a few more frames and then show you. All right, 30 frames in and we have some pretty massive shockwave happening. So this is what it looks like. I love the beginning of it. And then it just sort of keeps rolling and rolling on itself. And I think it's pretty cool. So just to remind you, if you wanted to emphasize this sort of rolling effect and all of the little velocities and swirls that the smoke has, you could improve the quality of that by increasing the conservation quality under dynamics. And you could even set this as high as maybe 64. I would maybe even set the steps per frame to 4 for my final simulation, just because in the very beginning, there's still a little bit of steppiness happening. You know, I can see especially here that it could use maybe a few more steps per frame. Then what you could also do, of course, is go back under grid and decrease the cell size and increase the resolution even more to get some even nicer detail in the swirls of the smoke. Like I showed you in the previous lesson, what you could also do is add a PHX turbulence just to add a bit of randomness to it. So maybe just a very subtle force, maybe 20 strength with a 1 meter size, just to break it up some more. Go under the volumetric settings, volumetric options, smoke opacity, and you can set the opacity to maybe 0.8, which will make it sort of much thicker and consequently larger scale, because smaller scale smoke is usually much thinner like this. But for something huge like a volcano, you could do maybe even like 0.99 and get some really thick sort of volcano ash smoke. You can play with the constant color of the smoke. So for the sake of this example, I'm gonna set this to maybe 0.6 again, because I kind of like that thin look. And I'm gonna go under create, standard V-Ray, and create a V-Ray plane. And we can give the V-Ray plane just a standard V-Ray material. And then I'm go under lights, V-Ray, and we can create a V-Ray sun. And just drag that out like that. You know, maybe raise the sun up. I'm just trying to show you how I did this basic sun lighting, which helps sell it a little bit, make it cooler. So you can go under rendering, environment, exposure control, and set that to V-Ray exposure control. And then under rendering, for just a quick dirty render, I would do bucket, and you can do 2 maximum subdiffs, and light cache of 1000 should do. And then just put your camera. All right, so this is what the render will look like. So that's something that you can play with. The setup is included inside of the project file if you want to look. Now, I would say the power really comes in when you start combining these techniques together. So later on, we're going to do an explosion. And a lot of times I see somebody post an explosion sort of on its own, just the fireball. I've certainly done that myself when I was starting out, but I learned that, you know, you can set up a shockwave like this in 5 minutes, and it will add so much. If you have sort of an explosion in the middle of this shockwave, it'll make for some much cooler effect. And then you can even do the RGB mixing that we did, so that there are some parts of the shockwave that are maybe brownish, as if it's their dirt, and some of them are black as the smoke. We're gonna do sort of an RGB explosion later on in this course as well. But these are just some techniques that I wanted you to start thinking about, and I'll see you in the next lesson.